Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on human trafficking prevention and the role of the financial services industry. My name is Danny McGlynn, and I'm the president of the Institute for Financial Integrity. IFI's mission is to protect the financial system from use by illicit actors and to combat threats to collective security through cutting-edge research, training, and education, including webinars like today. It's great to see so much interest in this topic. We have folks joining today from the public, private, and nonprofit sectors from over 20 countries and 5 continents around the world. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending upon where you are. We appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules to be part of this important session, and we hope you take away some valuable information and insights. Before we begin, let me quickly go over a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we will share the link with you after in case you miss or want to revisit something or share it with your colleagues. Please feel free to submit questions using the Q&A tab on your screen. For me, it's on the top right. We'll try to address as many of them as time permits, including during the Q&A segment at the end. And thank you to those who submitted questions ahead of time. And we've worked some of those into our discussion, and we'll cover as many as possible. Finally, you'll notice an area for documents on your screen, which includes some key resources about combating human trafficking that were published by the Financial Action Task Force, FinCEN, the State Department, and the Council of Europe. So feel free to check those out for more information if interested. So without further ado, let me introduce our fabulous panelists, starting with Megan Lundstrom, who is the Chief Executive Officer at Polaris, a nonprofit organization that leads a survivor-centered, justice and equity-driven movement to end human trafficking. Megan is a nationally recognized expert on human trafficking, data-driven systems for reform, and survivor-led policy and program design. She leads Polaris's national strategy, operations, and partnerships to integrate advocacy, research, and technology to prevent and disrupt trafficking. As part of that work, Megan has collaborated on projects across government agencies, the private sector, and non-governmental organizations to develop tools and guidance that help professionals identify and respond to trafficking. Tori Hill is a senior manager for Western Union's Financial Intelligence Unit, and she leads Western Union's Anti-Human Trafficking Initiative. Tori oversees investigations and strategic analysis related to human trafficking, including child exploitation. She educates Western Union agents and employees about related typologies, formulates FIU priorities for combating human trafficking, and manages relationships with law enforcement, NGOs, and other human trafficking and child exploitation focused entities. Prior to Western Union, Tori spent over 10 years working with yours truly at the Treasury Department's Office of Intelligence and Analysis, where she did incredible work mapping out terrorist support networks and supporting U.S. and partner efforts to disrupt and deter terrorist financing. And Catherine Woods is an associate managing director here at the Institute for Financial Integrity. She serves as our lead subject matter expert on cartels, Chinese money laundering networks, illicit procurement networks, and much more. Catherine has spent more than 15 years in senior and specialist positions in global banks and fintech startups, including as a financial intelligence and investigations senior analyst at HSBC and leader of public-private partnerships and outreach programs for Standard Chartered. Catherine also represented financial services at the UK's Joint Money Laundering Intelligence Task Force, where she helped lead a subgroup focused on anti-human trafficking. So let's now jump into the discussion. Here's our agenda. Broadly speaking, we're going to cover the basics about human trafficking and countering human trafficking, the latest trends and assessments, how to detect potential human trafficking activities and transactions, and finally, key challenges and best practices. And we should have some time at the end for Q&A. So let's get started with the basics about human trafficking and countering human trafficking. Megan, can you please help set the scene here and share some key points about human trafficking, some common myths, and some notable facts and statistics for us?
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here today. So I want to bring up just a couple key points so that we're all starting off this conversation together on the same foundation. So the first point that I want to bring up around human trafficking is that anybody can be trafficked. The reality is that some people are far more vulnerable than others because they have greater unmet needs. And so what we know from over 2 decades of anti-trafficking work here in the United States in particular is that vulnerable populations include people living in poverty or in unstable housing situations, as well as people with a history of trauma or substance use disorders. When you look at the findings from the National Survivor Study that Polaris released in 2023, which is the largest study in the US on and with survivors of human trafficking, we found that prior to their trafficking, survivors reported experiencing other vulnerabilities at alarmingly high rates. So 83% experienced poverty, 96% experienced physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, and 93% experienced substance abuse and mental health challenges. So the next point that I really want to bring up and make sure that we are all understanding how human trafficking happens and what it looks like and who it happens to is that traffickers target vulnerable people that have needs that aren't being met elsewhere, and traffickers either can fulfill those or promise to fulfill them. And so that may be material support, that could be a place to live, food, clothing, those kinds of things. Other times it can be love, emotional support, a sense of belonging, or protection. One of the very common myths that is out there is that victims are overwhelmingly targeted and trafficked by strangers, and that stranger abductions are the primary way of traffickers finding victims. And the reality is that while that can and does happen, absolutely, it's a very small percentage. So most survivors are trafficked by people they know and trust. That could be a romantic partner or a family member or an employer or somebody from their community, again, that has offered them some type to meet some unmet need. So those are just a few thoughts and facts around human trafficking to get us going today.
Thank you, Megan. Really helpful points. Also, I wanted to get you to kick it off talking about global efforts to counter human trafficking, given your role and Polaris's role. Can you talk a little bit about Polaris and in particular, the role of the financial sector? And I understand you all have an FIU, so the role of Polaris's Financial Intelligence Unit.
Absolutely. So we know that globally, the most effective anti-trafficking strategies, we're really seeing this trend moving away from just awareness campaigns as we all start to collectively learn more about this issue and what it looks like, and moving towards disrupting profit, addressing fraud and supply chain abuse. And there's definitely a focus. I mean, we're all here today to learn and discuss more around financial flows, labor markets, and also what the private sector can do to both prevent and respond to human trafficking. At Polaris specifically, our role is not to duplicate enforcement or intelligence work, but to really focus on survivor-centered insight, aggregate cross-sector data, and identify where systems are breaking down so that prevention and accountability efforts really truly reduce harm over time, and we start to see impact in both that prevention and intervention and response spaces. Human trafficking, especially labor trafficking, operates through fraud, payroll abuse, shell vendors, subcontracting schemes, which means that banks and other financial institutions can be really effective intervention points to detect, disrupt, and prevent exploitation at scale. So our financial intelligence unit is actually in a pivot right now, but very excited as our organization moves in a new strategic direction. So the financial intelligence unit here at Polaris is going to be embedded in both our data and intelligence team and our survivor care team. So again, really grounded in survivor input and stakeholder needs and focused on systems change and lowering barriers to access financial systems and products and services for survivors, while also partnering with banks to identify traffickers and trends that impact the financial transactions and financial industry more broadly. So most of our work historically in the Financial Intelligence Unit has been domestic focused here in the United States. But going forward, starting late last year, we just moved into a partnership with a global partner, Stop the Traffic, who is based in the UK. And our financial intelligence units are working together to co-create intelligence briefs and trend reports for financial institutions, and particularly AML and financial crimes folks.
Excellent. That's awesome to hear about the evolution, and we'll definitely be on the lookout for those intelligence products that you all put out. And speaking of FIUs, Tori, I want to go to you next to discuss the role of Western Union's financial intelligence, and in particular, your Office of Typology, Investigations, and Strategic Analysis, and what you do as a leader of Western Union's anti-human trafficking initiative.
Sure, thanks, Danny. Western Union's FIU, like many financial institutions, FIU is the heart and soul of our effort to combat human trafficking and child exploitation. It's where we establish our priorities based on our exposure and open source and law enforcement trends. It's where we conduct our investigations of higher risk consumers and agent locations that may have been identified by law enforcement or may be in higher risk geographies. And it's from where we coordinate law enforcement. And I'll get into a little bit later some of the more proactive efforts that our strategic analysis team undertakes. I think that's really what has helped us move the ball forward in some aspects in terms of identification, reporting, and mitigation. But to give you a little sense of how Western Union's corporate commitment goes a little bit beyond the traditional FIU, we have an anti-human trafficking initiative that has been around since 2013. And it really is driven by three pillars: education and awareness, partnerships and info exchange, and ad hoc investigations and innovation. And I'll give you a few examples of some of the more non-traditional and complementary things that initiative undertakes to expand on the work that FIU does. First, we're always on the lookout for relationships that we can establish to obtain bulk data, high confidence leads, to help us look for the problem at scale. We do a variety of things that fall outside of the standard FIU remit, like piloting, providing promo codes for Western Union use by survivors in an attempt to help them bolster their financial situations. We contribute to external reports and working groups to develop red flags, groups like FATF subgroups, ICMIC subgroups, you name it. We like to be in the room to help as we can. We lead information sharing efforts across financial institutions by sharing high confidence lead data to help others. And then our innovation and ad hoc investigations team handles quick turn or event focused investigations that are sort of outside the regular cadence of our FIU teams. So urgent missing child cases that we might receive from NCMEC, or event focused reporting designed to support task forces that are stood up around events like the Super Bowl or the World Cup. So I'll stop there. I could continue ad nauseum.
No, that's really cool and super comprehensive. It's great the Western Union and that you are taking such an important leadership role for the community. Catherine, turning to you next. I know later we're going to talk about the role of money mules and the methods used to recruit and control them, particularly by professional money laundering networks. So to give us some context for that, can you briefly discuss what are money mules and the scale of professional money laundering?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Danny. So money mules are, I'll outline them. We're starting to dig into some of the detail in our webinar right now. Money mules start with human trafficking, but they extend into other types of exploitation that might not quite be human trafficking, as well as into people who are actively complicit and involved, and we wouldn't see that as human trafficking at all. So why do we need money mules, and what are they? Criminal networks like cartels have immense amounts of cash, and what they need to do is get that into the financial system, make it look as though it's legitimate money, and then they can move that around and use it to either advance their criminal enterprises or for lifestyle or influence or other activities that those organized criminal groups want to fund. So one way that they do this is using money mules. Money mules are individuals who either put cash into the financial system or move it around. And by splitting those criminal proceeds, like the cash from narcotic sales, for example, we're talking about billions of dollars, by splitting that into small amounts, deposited or moved by multiple different individuals, the objective is to reduce the risk of detection or the possibility of detection. So money mules might open bank accounts using their real identity. They might receive illicit funds like cash into those bank accounts or deposit funds. So they might get cash and deposit smaller amounts into lots of different ATMs, move money around to or from other bank accounts, use cashiers, checks, crypto, gift cards, prepaid debit cards, or other forms of value. Or in some cases, they provide access to their bank account to members of the criminal network who will then operate the account. They kind of take over control of it. So often money mules are caught really quickly. For example, if they receive the proceeds of fraud, the person who has been defrauded will identify that, report it, and those funds can be traced. So a little bit like drug mules, the concept of money mule or that wording is derived from drug mules. They are considered as disposable by these criminal networks. They might be caught quite quickly, but there are lots of them. And so proportions of that money still get through. So criminal networks need a lot of money mules. As we said at the start, some of them may be unknowing. They may think that there's some kind of they're operating a legitimate activity. Maybe they've been part of a romance scam or something like that. Some of them are willfully blind, so they are deliberately ignoring signs that they are involved in criminality, and some of them are directly complicit. They know this is criminal activity, but they are doing it because of some financial gain or, for alignment with a criminal network that we're part of. So how does this intersect with human trafficking? So in some cases, people who are targeted by human trafficking, so victims of trafficking, will have their identity used. So they're not just being exploited through sexual exploitation or labor exploitation, but their identities are also used to launder the proceeds of criminality. Another intersection point with human trafficking is that money mules can move the proceeds of trafficking or other types of exploitation. So even if the money mule isn't directly involved themselves, that criminal network is moving human trafficking proceeds. And some of them, of course, as we said, may be willing. These professional money laundering networks have huge networks and huge amounts of influence. So, for example, in the United Kingdom, one Chinese money laundering network controlled 600 accounts at a single bank. That was the number of kind of mule accounts that they had operating. And what we'll circle back to later in the webinar, so giving some context here, particularly Chinese money laundering networks, because they have a really critical role in laundering cartel proceeds. So they have emerged as being the professional money launderers of choice for cartels. The drivers of this, very briefly to provide the context of like why Chinese money laundering networks and their money mules so extensive. So in China, there's a restriction on moving money out of China. It's $50,000 a year. That's the maximum. Chinese nationals want access to money outside China in excess of that amount. So it's political uncertainty. Maybe they want it for investment. They may want to fund tuition and living expenses for students or other relatives living outside China, but they can't move it using the legitimate financial system. So what they do is they go to a Chinese money launderer and they will use various laundering methodologies to provide access to funds in various countries, including the United States. so that Chinese national has access to money. Where do they get the cash from in the United States to give to these Chinese nationals? From cartels. Cartels have a lot of money that needs to be laundered. Chinese nationals want money in the United States, so it creates a supply and demand that really furthers this type of criminality. And money mules are a key part in that. So I won't go into more detail now. I know we have a lot to cover, but that sets the scene for when we come back to talking more about how money mules are targeted and what might be their characteristics.
Awesome. Thanks, Catherine. And I learned something. I didn't know that the term money mules comes from the term drug mules. So let's move on to assessments and trends. And Tori, if you could start this topic off for us and share some of the latest assessments and trends that you're seeing associated with financial indicators of human trafficking and related crimes, including financially motivated sextortion.
Sure, thanks, Danny. I'm going to focus on Western Union's exposure over the last few years to a few subsets: sex trafficking, child exploitation, and sextortion. And I'll get into a little bit later our intel gaps around labor trafficking. So potential sex trafficking, we do have a very heavy global footprint. So here I've broken down our top countries with a touch point by transaction volume to sex trafficking. You'll see that Romania pops for us. That's a long-standing source country for trafficking organizations as well as trafficked individuals. You can see the nationalities there on the right. We're also seeing an open source surge and possibly a corresponding Western Union exposure to the trafficking of Latin American women and transgender individuals to Western Europe, particularly those from Colombia, Brazil, Venezuela. And then on the pie chart on the right, you can see that about 3/4 of the transaction activity conducted in our higher confidence cases linked to the sex trafficking of adults occurs via retail locations. So people who go into our storefronts or into the grocery store where there's a Western Union counter to transact rather than using our app or our website. Next slide, please. Potential child exploitation activity. So while we don't know for sure, because most of this high confidence activity is derived from subpoena information that is fairly generic, we suspect that a good portion of Western Union's exposure in particular, is related to the live streaming abuse, where children abused online for people who watch what they call shows. And here you can see the directionality. So the US is by far the most problematic concentration for us in terms of people sending funds to watch these shows or otherwise consume child sexual abuse material. Western Europe is also a big consumer. And then pay hotspots for us. The Philippines is far and away the leader, which should be no surprise to anybody who follows this issue. I think that is a global epicenter and that probably spans all financial institutions. But some other ones that are seem to be emerging more and more for us include Colombia and Madagascar, as well as Thailand. You can see the top corridors in that middle graphic, and then unlike in-person sex trafficking, including of adults, the pie chart on the right shows that we're sort of seeing the inverse in what kinds of products are used for this crime. It's largely a digital phenomenon, and that makes sense because the abuse is happening online, so they're already online, and that's how they pay for the abuse. Next slide, please. Within higher risk consumer activity for child exploitation, we are also looking to see which consumers are traveling to our high-risk jurisdictions for in-person abuse of children. And we see that by people who will send to themselves for pickup in their destination country. They may not want to carry cash, and retrieving funds from a Western Union upon arrival is a way to quickly get local currency. And so that's how we can assess travel. People who are typically transacting, say, in the US, and then have a transaction in the Philippines. and the hotspots for travel largely overlap with our live streaming hotspots. Next slide, please. Sextortion, we consider to be a human trafficking adjacent phenomenon. And I want to talk about it a little bit, including because of the intelligence gaps we have. Again, the US is where the majority of the victims that we know about who've been victimized through Western Union reside. And for those who are unfamiliar with sextortion, it's a phenomenon where an individual typically meets someone new online, and they're either tricked into sending intimate imagery of themselves, or the perpetrator uses AI to generate fake imagery of the person, say, without their clothes on. And then very quickly that goes from a casual conversation to an extortion conversation. Send me money or your images will be released to all of your contacts, etc. And it's a split in terms of what kind of products we're seeing associated with this transaction activity, a split between digital and in-person. And we think part of that is, unlike the live streaming phenomenon, we think there is a middleman or a money mule component in many cases, where someone, say, from the country where the organization targeting people with these scams resides lives overseas. Like, for example, from the Ivory Coast, lives in the United States. They may collect from targets in whatever form of currency the target has available. And with kids, that often includes gift cards. And then that intermediary will send the money back to, say, the Ivory Coast. And that's especially problematic for financial institutions because it can often blend in with regular remittance activity. It doesn't feature those classic patterns that help us distinguish illicit activity from remittance activity. And what I want to highlight here is that most of our, at Western Union, lead information is coming from customer complaints who call in and say this has happened to them and want to get their money back. So it's a pretty high confidence but unusual source of lead information for us in terms of the human trafficking sphere. We're used to starting with data from, say, an NGO or from law enforcement. Next slide, please. I just wanted to include this to give everyone a sense of this is happening everywhere. The footprint across the US aligns with where the people are. Next slide, please. And just to quickly touch on the pay countries. The Ivory Coast is overwhelmingly problematic for Western Union. We have a variety of mitigation efforts underway there. The Philippines is increasingly becoming a hot pay country for sextortion activity, as well as the Dominican Republic. This is an especially difficult typology to spot proactively, and really speaks to the importance of law enforcement relationships, customer relationships, and relationships with other institutions that have lead information. And I say that because if you see in the key stats box on the right, most people who have been sextorted only send 1 or 2 transactions. That's not enough to create a pattern. And the dollar amounts are very in line with regular remittance dollar amounts. So we're not able to spot unusual networks. We're not able to spot unusual dollar amounts, and often we're not able to spot unusual combinations of nationalities. I think that is my last trend slide.
All right. No, that was, even though you have big intel gaps, I think what you're able to glean from all that data is really interesting and hopefully helpful to others who are on the webinar who are following this issue as well. Megan, we did have someone in the audience from a global bank submit a question during registration. So I wanted to kick this one over to you. Could you talk about the challenges faced with huge sports events like the 2026 FIFA World Cup? What should we look for? So do you expect an increase in human trafficking around these events? If so, what might that look like, and how might it intersect with the financial sector?
Yeah. This is a huge topic right now, especially in the US, Canada, and Mexico, with World Cup coming this summer to these three countries. So I think first and foremost, it's always important to name kind of that correlation versus causation piece of, major events don't create human trafficking. They simply amplify those systems that are strained, or there are, failures in those systems that already exist. So large events like World Cup, where there is concentrated groups of people. So just like Tori showed the US map, and concentrations of cases are really in line with larger density areas of the country. And so we see that same thing with large sporting events, where you have a lot of people in that area. And so that is going to strain the local labor and service systems. And traffickers are already exploiting those systems. It's just that you have that concentration because of an increase in just general public activity over that time period. So we know here in the United States, we talk quite a bit about sex trafficking around major sporting events, but it's also really, really important that we are thinking about and looking at and considering labor trafficking and labor exploitation around these events as well, especially through temporary and subcontracted workforces that are coming into the area or hiring additional workers. So if you think about specific industries, travel, hospitality, tourism, lodging, food, products that are being sold around that event, that's where you're going to see those temporary workforces, and you're going to see those risks, again, that already exist, just occurring at scale. And so I had mentioned this in my opening, but labor trafficking operates through fraud, payroll manipulation, shelf staffing companies, subcontracting, abuse, all of which move through formal financial systems. And so again, the financial sector is at this really critical intersection that you can identify and intervene, and really be thinking about what do those patterns look like, and looking in these specific geographic regions where a major event might be happening. And then the last piece I'll say about that, because this is one of those topics right now that everybody's asking questions about, and I also feel like I could talk about for quite a while, since Polaris is working on some initiatives this year around World Cup. But we also know that, large events, we do see increased law enforcement presence focused on anti-trafficking efforts. And that is a necessary part of addressing human trafficking, because it is obviously a crime. But what we also have seen historically from major events is that increased enforcement oftentimes can produce more arrests, but not necessarily better anti-trafficking outcomes. And oftentimes in those increased enforcement efforts, unfortunately, victims often are criminalized alongside their traffickers, or in place of their traffickers. So financial investigations, again, can really provide this critical shift in accountability upstream by disrupting traffickers' networks and their revenue without harming victims and survivors in that process. So that's what I will say about large sporting events, and in particular World Cup coming this year.
Thanks, Megan. Really, really important points. And you mentioned law enforcement. We have a number of folks from the law enforcement community on this webinar as well. So thanks for making those important points. And then on this, Catherine, as you mentioned, we've seen Chinese money laundering networks are increasingly significant in laundering cartel proceeds and other criminal finance. And money mules are a key element of this methodology. So how do Chinese money laundering networks recruit and control those who function as money mules?
Yeah, so just to provide an indication on the scale of what we're talking about, over the period 2020 to 2024, there were 20,000 suspicious activity reports to FinCEN referencing individuals purporting to be Chinese students, and that represents $13.8 billion in transactions. They came from banks, MSBs, casinos, and others as well. And what's really important to distinguish here is that this is what we're speaking about is not a commentary on the Chinese people or students legitimately studying. These are criminal networks undertaking criminal activity for their own benefit. We call them Chinese money laundering networks because they are primarily driven by movement of capital flight from China, as we spoke about before. So that's a really important distinction to make. That this is not directed at people who are just legitimately working or studying, but it is relevant to delve into why particularly are students involved, and particularly Chinese students. And this comes back to Megan's point about in the context of human trafficking, the traffickers are people that they know or from their own community, and we see the same parallels when it comes to Chinese money laundering networks and who they target. So we don't have specific data in the United States on how this operates here, but we do have it in the United Kingdom. And what happened there was the United Kingdom Home Office undertook a study, and it identified that 12.5% of students were asked or coerced by someone of their own nationality, so that's by another Chinese person, to undertake two illicit activities. One was laundering money through their own bank account, so the student's bank account, and one was to accept packages of illicit substances. So these were just, small packages. What's really noteworthy is that we might think that there's some coercive aspect to this, and it's accurate that 1 in 4 of those students was actually being coerced, but 3 out of 4 of them were simply asked, and nearly 33% of those individuals said that they would feel compelled or highly compelled to help someone from their same community or their same nationality. So this is where those kind of cultural obligations influence who is being targeted, and as Megan said, it's often people in positions of kind of trust or authority or within that person's own network. So if we look at another specific example, so we've mentioned that 3 out of 4 are simply asked, but 1 in 4 are coerced. So let's move on now to look at an example of how that coercion can actually happen. This is a UK example as well. So this is from the West Midlands Police, who undertook a really effective investigation that recognised cultural context. The way that these overseas students were coerced was in illegal casinos. So the cards were actually marked with infrared markings. A player at the table who was part of the criminal network was provided with information about what cards the others, the students held, and they could use that to make sure that the play in that illegal casino meant that the students lost. Those gambling debts were then used to coerce their involvement in criminality. So these are some of the, quite sophisticated methods that can be used to coerce involvement in criminal activity and the exploitation that involves. But it's also against a backdrop of cultural expectation, and in 3 out of 4 situations that the person would simply need to be asked.
Excellent. No, thank you for those examples, Catherine. Now we're going to get into detection. How do we detect this stuff? And Tori, I know this is you've done a ton of work on this, so I'm going to turn to you first to talk about what is it that you and your team do to help detect, illuminate, or even disrupt transactions associated with human trafficking. To the extent that you could share with us case studies or examples, that'd be great. And I'm gonna even make it a more complex setup for you, because we had a couple people in the chat asking questions that you may be able to hit on as you go through your points here on these slides. Someone asked whether sextortion is an AML or fraud problem. Someone else asked, are you able to get enough info to differentiate between sex and labor trafficking? Are the key players or typologies the same or different? So over to you, Tori.
Questions. I will try, but if I fail, feel free to ping me at the end, Danny. Okay, I want to So we do all of the classic FIU things: respond to law enforcement leads, blow out networks to see who else we may be able to identify and share back, and then archive all of our higher confidence investigations, so that when we constantly look back for emerging trends, emerging locations, change in dollar amounts, change in nationalities, et cetera, we're constantly doing that. But what I found, and I think one of our biggest challenges, is frankly getting law enforcement's attention, simply because of their limited bandwidth, especially now. And so what we put great pride in is trying to layer on top of our patterns and the indicators we typically look for some other element of derogatory information that is designed to hopefully get law enforcement's attention and save them time. So the first example I'd like to share is web scraping. We've developed an internal capability to web scrape a variety of websites that are linked to sex trafficking, that we know through a variety of open source information, including studies done by Polaris. And I will say that this goes a bit of a ways to why we have more gaps with labor trafficking. There simply aren't the same kinds and same volume of websites that are advertising people who are being labor trafficked versus sex trafficked. So we don't have to rely on others necessarily for leads to investigate sex trafficking. But anyway, a couple of years ago, we partnered with Polaris and used some of the learnings they published in a report on illicit massage businesses. And we decided to look for the red flags that they had identified and that we often see in our own sex trafficking investigations, to try and identify people who may be sex trafficked and possibly labor trafficked through illicit massage businesses around the United States. And so what we did was, there's a website called rubmaps.ch, and they list, you can pay to subscribe, but even if you don't, you can still see a variety of targetable information. You can search by city, and it will list massage business locations, their phone number, their address. And if you subscribe, you can read reviews of the kind of sexual services that people say they've been provided there. And so we scraped the addresses and the phone numbers, matched them against home addresses and phone numbers used by Western Union consumers, and then applied a variety of triage criteria, looking for our common red flags, looking for additional due diligence, et cetera, to get to higher confidence. And just to give you a sense of the kinds of red flags we look for, it's looking for people who may be using the home address of the the address of the massage business as their home address. Can be a higher risk indicator, and that's unusual for a Western Union customer to use a business address as their home address. We look for indications of travel. We know that women are often moved in from Asian countries, particularly China, through Flushing, New York, and then moved around the country, both to meet customer demands, but also to keep the women from establishing local networks and local connections. And then we look for other advertisements linked to the same phone numbers or the same people, suggesting that there's some sort of enterprise component to this, to maybe an escorting business or a sex ad, or anything involving sex services. Okay, and so that's just one way we get after it. And then we break down a variety of the data that we see. And here you can see that what we found showed that we do indeed mirror the open source information. We had a majority of our consumers transacting in Flushing. 30% of our primary subjects, so those people who use a home address or a phone matching the illicit massage business, transacted in a state outside of their home address state. And then we're able to slice and dice the data, however helpful and to know where to really prioritize our outreach efforts and say, hey, New York law enforcement, look out for this SAR, et cetera. Next slide, please. The problem with most of the transaction networks, although we did find several helpful anomalies, but most of the networks are small and involve just a few people sending back to China. And that is very hard to detect proactively without doing something like this web scrape. So that's sort of the value of layering on the additional intelligence. You can catch the activity that wouldn't otherwise rise to the surface. We did see several networks that linked multiple illicit massage businesses by phone numbers, and certainly prioritized our outreach efforts around those in order to potentially maximize disruption. Next slide,
Cool.
please.
And then just real quick, Tori, by web scraping, somebody asked, what do you mean by web scraping? It's just you going to openly available websites that have bulk data, like the one you mentioned, Rub Maps, right?
Right. It's essentially just lifting the phone numbers or lifting the home address in a way that we can easily bounce against transaction data. The second sort of proactive way, and this gets to a geolocation question that came up at one point, that is helpful for our efforts to get after live streaming abuse of children, is bulk IP address analysis. And so we partner with organizations, including the Child Rescue Coalition, which is a nonprofit group that is in the peer-to-peer platforms where CSAM, child sexual abuse material, is being traded and downloaded. And they share with us the IP addresses that they see associated with this activity, as well as the date and time information, the country associated with the IP address, and a few other details. And then we go through a fairly rigorous filtering process to match those IP addresses to our digital consumers who are sending online. We capture IP addresses for them to see what population is worth a further look. And if we could go to the next slide, please. So our goal is to, again, layer additional information on top of our patterns. So the additional information, Child Rescue Coalition can see, okay, this IP address was downloaded these 75 files with this metadata and these file names, et cetera. But they can't see the who, the name of the person, their home address, their phone number. And so when we get to a high confidence IP match, we fill in those gaps for law enforcement. You can see the black rows indicate the types of information that Western Union can add on top of the CRC information in red. Next slide, please. And then part of our filtering, again, to get us to highest confidence as possible, is to look at the transaction activity for those classic indicators of live streaming or high-risk travel to a destination often associated with child sex abuse. And here are just 4 examples of those classic networks. The 4 consumers in the blue frames were those who matched Child Rescue Coalition IP addresses. And they are, by and large, sending to multiple people in the Philippines with whom they have no apparent familial or nationality connection based on country of birth information, their name. It's overwhelmingly male senders. In fact, it's all male senders, often older, and it's often a female receiver in the Philippines. And then it's a variety of irregular low-dollar transactions. And so we couple that Western Union analysis with the CRC analysis and report it to law enforcement and mitigate the problem for Western Union. Next slide, please.
Are those Austria flags, by the way?
Let's go back. Maybe too small
All right.
for me to
Okay.
remember, and
Just
I see
wondering.
so many of these that.
All right. Sorry, we could go on.
No worries. Let's see if I can see over here. Yes, very possibly. And so the third and final example that I wanted to share, because this is newer for us and we've seen great value, so I just wanted to basically make a sales pitch to other FIs to consider doing the same thing, is after spending a few years trying to go state by state to get lists of registered sex offenders, gave up and purchased a list from a vendor. And we filtered that list to those with previous crimes against children, and then bounced off our data, starting with a huge set, looking for those needles in the haystack. And we bounced against name and address, name, DOB, and state, combinations of that get us to higher confidence that we're not just hitting John Smith. And then out of those 350,000 registered sex offenders that we searched, we identified a few dozen who appeared high risk to us based on their travel, based on those red flags that I talked about previously, and or links to previous investigations that we conducted, either based on open source reporting or law enforcement information. And to give you a sense of why this layering and this sort of on top of our standard work is so important, I've got two examples of people we probably would not have caught with our standard traps and filters because their activity deviated from the standard pattern, and patterns are only so good as being able to catch the people who operate in a pattern fashion. So this person is a registered sex offender in Florida with significant previous crimes against children, who was sending to the Dominican Republic and Colombia, that are both high-risk jurisdictions for us for child exploitation. His average dollar amount was low, so that was consistent. But what deviated significantly from the norm was that he was going into agent locations to send these funds. And as you will recall me mentioning previously, usually this is a digital transaction because the abuse is happening online. So maybe this person was going into an agent location to hide their transactions from someone at home who may have had, for example, access to credit card statements or bank statements, just a theory. And one more example, this is a registered sex offender in Texas who, almost 30 years prior was convicted, and it really shows the problem of recidivism with this crime. But we would not have caught this individual probably because of the high dollar amounts they're sending to the Philippines. And it's significantly higher than your standard payment for live streaming. And so I hope that demonstrates the value of sort of searching for additional types of lead information to use.
Yeah, no, that's great work, and I hope others in the community sort of replicate that. I guess here, let's see. This goes back to so Western Union has one sort of business model, but others like banks have different models. And I know Catherine and Megan, you both have worked with banks. Are there other red flag indicators that you'd highlight that banks should be on the lookout for to potentially detect human trafficking and similar things? And it looks like, Catherine, you have a slide here on Money Mule red flags.
Yeah, so I'll just speak briefly on this. These red flags, there's a document available in your document downloads. If you look at that tab, it's the IFI article on students' debt and duty. All of these red flags are in that article. So I'll just pick out a couple to speak about. I think the main point is if we think about what is the objective of money launderers, it's to obscure where the actual origin of those illicit funds. So they're going to be doing everything that they can to hide where they came from. What that means is if you are a bank, particularly a global bank or a correspondent bank, it's not necessarily going to be obvious that these are the proceeds of human trafficking. But what you can do is look at red flags that may indicate the involvement, for example, of professional money laundering networks. And then, you file your report or you work with law enforcement and they can take it further. So just very briefly picking out a couple, as we said, during the kind of KYC stage, during identification, if there are irregularities in documents, for example, a passport and visa contain the same photograph despite being issued years apart, that's a red flag. Or if the person in the identity document looks similar to the applicant, but isn't the same person. During the client lifecycle, during transaction monitoring, we spoke about how students can be targeted by these professional money laundering networks. So if they're receiving wire transfers described as tuition or living expenses, but the amounts and the timing don't correspond with the academic year, those would be red flags as well. if there are indicators on the account of DIGO, so this is laundering through the purchase of high value luxury items, that can be an indicator of both the involvement of professional money laundering networks, but also victims of human trafficking can be used as part of these schemes. So in the article that we mentioned available for download, there's a link through to more information about DIGO if that's relevant to any of the work that you're doing. And if we think about debt bondage, so this is where there is control, for example, through gambling debts. One of the red flags for that is if a customer is being escorted and monitored while they are in the bank. Someone might be with them, for example, describing themselves as a translator or a friend, but they're actually a member of a laundering or criminal organization who is controlling that customer or holding custody of their identity documents.
Cool. No, thanks for highlighting those, Catherine. And then Megan, I don't know if you had anything to add on this topic, or we could transition to the final one, which is, are there any sort of biggest challenges that the community faces encountering human trafficking, or on the flip side, best practices that you'd want to highlight for the audience?
Yeah, I think Catherine and Tori are brilliant. So nothing to add to that. Really, just very insightful. I feel like I learn something new every time I'm in conversation with folks like Catherine and Tori. So I'm happy to kind of shift into this final piece as we come up towards the end of this webinar too. I think one of the things that Polaris is really encouraging the financial sector and other industries and across stakeholder groups to really make the shift from asking that first question around, did we make the identification or did we file the report, to doing some systems-wide reflections. Did we change the system that allowed exploitation to be profitable? What are the patterns? Tori talked a little bit about those patterns, but what are those patterns in the systems that criminals are taking advantage of, and how do we address those patterns so that type of behavior or transaction cannot continue to occur in other situations? Or how can we add that into our knowledge base of what to be looking for around these types of financial crimes? I think also this conversation around sex trafficking and labor trafficking, integrating other typologies. Again, here in the United States, we really started with a focus in anti-trafficking work around sex trafficking. And so making sure that we continue to learn around labor exploitation and supply chain abuse. I think one of the challenging things, and I'm not a financial professional, but just as an observation and as a survivor, really understanding some of those nuances between sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Labor trafficking, sometimes there's an absence of payments or transactions, whereas in sex trafficking, you may see a pattern of transactions that doesn't look normal. So I think it's important to just continue to learn about these different typologies and how they show up. And then those trends change all the time, as Tori and Catherine both talked about. So I think to just kind of close out my thoughts on that, building feedback loops with trusted partners, knowing where that intelligence is changing investigations or different systems behaviors, and then prioritizing that, both the financial disruption piece and then also prevention and restoration outcomes for survivors. What can we be doing to make sure that vulnerable communities have access to financial products and services, and for survivors who have exited a trafficking situation and maybe were negatively impacted, with their credit report or having accounts closed in the past due to their trafficker using their accounts. How can we help them get access back to those systems? So I think those are the final thoughts for me in terms of both challenges and best practices and kind of what do we do now.
Thank you, Megan. Really, really insightful and much appreciated. We have about 1 or 2 minutes left. Tori, maybe, or Catherine, anything that's really sticking out in addition to what Megan just said on challenges and best practices that you want to leave with our audience with?
Ooh, hard to narrow to just a few seconds. So I'll go with low-hanging fruit. One of the things that has consistently driven me nuts over the last 10 years is the difficulty of acquiring compiled, already public available information to work backwards from for lead information for investigations. We have convictions of human traffickers, but it's on the financial industry or each institution to scrape court records, to scrape press reporting, to scrape DOJ releases. And that takes time and money. If we could be provided updated, regularized lists of convicted stuff that's already in the open source, I think that would go a long way to helping pattern development and risk mitigation. Thank
you. It seems like that was your number one piece of advice. So much appreciated. That's gonna. I think we just hit time. So just to close this out, I want to thank you all, Tori and Megan and Catherine, for sharing such great insights and expertise with us. Thank you for the important work that you do on countering human trafficking and protecting the integrity of the financial system. And thank you to all our attendees for joining us from so many different places today. I saw we had an active chat early on, so that's great. I want to mention our next webinar, which is on February 25th. It's Cartels and Criminality, Money Laundering, Sanctions, and Evolving Risks. And that's going to feature Catherine, who's going to be presenting her findings on a major report that we're going to publish soon on cartel money laundering. And joining Catherine is going to be Him Das, the former director of FinCEN and senior managing director at K2 Integrity. So we're going to be following up with everyone here with an email, and that will contain a link to that registration as well as the new report that we're going to be putting out on cartel money laundering. So thanks again, everyone. Have a great day, and we look forward to connecting with you soon.